amazingly possible moment. When it's white folks in pain, we understand there are systemic causes. When it's black and brown folks in pain, we ignore the system and we focus on the individual and we blame them because we lack radical empathy.
You have to say Black Lives Matter rather than all lives matter, because we said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. We said all, but we didn't mean all.
The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling working class white people that their enemies are black and brown.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Speak Out with Tim Wise, a project of Speak Out, the nation's premier nonprofit speakers bureau, which for over 25 years has been bringing educators and activists to campuses and communities across America to engage in meaningful dialogue about the pressing issues that confront our country and the world. If you enjoy the program, one way you can express your support is to become a monthly patron and sustainer of the show by signing up at www.patreon.com/Speak Out with Tim Wise. You can pledge as little as $2 a month or as much as you'd like, and not only know that you're supporting our efforts, but also gain access to bonus content, like premium commentaries on the events of the week, as well as signed books or DVDs. You can also make a one-time donation to the program at speakoutnow.org via PayPal, and make sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. My guest today on the program is Bettie Kirkland. She is the executive director of Project Return, an organization that is now celebrating, I believe, 40 years in Nashville, Tennessee, helping formerly incarcerated folks to reintegrate into the so-called free world, helping with both employment opportunities and, most recently, helping formerly incarcerated folks to find housing, stable housing, throughout the greater Nashville community. It is a fantastic organization founded by two visionary leaders back in 1979, the Reverend Bill Barnes and the Reverend Don Beiswinger, both of whom realized and had a vision for this city that would allow formerly incarcerated folks to find their way back home, so to speak, and to return to the society, both healthy and productive contributors to that. And so today I'll be talking to Bettie Kirkland about their efforts, some of their recently expanded efforts in the greater Nashville area, and ways in which we ought to be thinking about the criminal justice system and about the people who get caught up in it, because so oftentimes we have stereotypes and assumptions about folks who are coming out of jail, coming out of prison, who come out with records and oftentimes have such a hard time finding work or places to live. We need our stereotypes to be challenged, and the kind of work that Project Return does really helps with that, because by placing folks in employment opportunities and in the communities, people get a chance to know one another, and those relationships help break down some of those barriers that keep us divided as a society. So I'm excited to talk to Bettie today, and I will have my conversation with Bettie Kirkland in just a second. I want to apologize in advance for some of the audio quality of the recording. I'm not a tech expert, as anyone who listens to this program knows. Folks are always real nice, and you tell me nice things about the quality of the show. But the truth is, I am winging it most of the time. I sort of know how to use this fancy microphone that I have, but every now and then, particularly when I'm doing an in-person interview, which I did for today's program, I forget to switch there's a switch on the back of the microphone, and it has 4 different settings, one of which is best if it's just me talking into the mic and maybe via Skype. And I have a program on the computer, a software program that records the guest's version on Skype, so I don't have to worry about that. But I set the microphone to just sort of pick me up, and it ostensibly, keeps all the surrounding noise from being picked up. Well, on this particular occasion, I got down to interview Bettie Kirkland at her office at Project Return, and I could not remember which setting was which. And rather than just do the smart thing, which would be to Google it, I had my computer with me. I could have just looked it up, but I wanted to get the interview rolling, and so I picked a setting that I thought was right. And a couple things happened. First, it made it where her voice picked up really well, but mine sounded like I was talking in like a huge metal box. And so I had to go back and literally re-record my questions. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, this seems weird, like the audio quality's not the same, it sounds like he's in a studio and she's in an open room, that is because that is true. I had to go back and re-record my questions to her and then used her original audio, which did pick up some ambient sound from the neighborhood where the office is, because again, I had the setting wrong. So the audio quality is not good. It glitches out at a couple of spots. I don't know why the program that I'm using does this, but every now and then you'll hear an audio glitch. I apologize for that. I promise I will get better at this as time goes on. But in any event, regardless of the audio quality, the content is good stuff. So I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Bettie Kirkland of Project Return. So first, let's just start off, if you could, explain to those who are listening to the show a little bit about Project Return, the work that you do, how long you have been doing it here in Nashville, and really why it is so important, not only in this town, but similar work, reintegrating formerly incarcerated people into the economy, into housing, into opportunity, not only here, but around the country.
The work is all about successful reentry after incarceration. So what we basically have is a massive system of really exiling folks, really taking them out of sight, out of mind, and putting them quite literally in cages in sort of far-flung areas where we, for the most part, enable ourselves to forget about them. And the thing that we need to remember is that more than 95% of them will be released and will return to our communities. They are routinely shunned. They are systematically excluded from all of those things that the rest of us understand implicitly that we need in order to survive, thrive, and otherwise exist in free society. Basic things like having a personal economy by which we are able to feed and clothe ourselves and like meet our basic needs. I mean, we don't even think too much about that. It's so like understood. And so when folks get out of prison by the thousands each year and they're excluded from those opportunities, it is an unworkable situation. And it means basically if they get out and they can't function, more and more they end up going back in. It's just how the system is functioning right now. We are really trying as best we can to interrupt that. We do it by interacting with individuals, helping them get their lives on track, providing them the opportunities that any of us would need in that situation.
Although I suspect a lot of my listeners probably know a little bit about the way in which formerly incarcerated people are excluded from opportunity, there's certainly a possibility that some folks might not. So when you say that people are excluded, in effect made persona non grata within the society, it's not really, it's not hyperbole, it's quite literal. Could you just, for the sake of our listeners who maybe are not up on that issue, talk a little bit about the kinds of barriers that folks face when they are released from incarceration, the kinds of policies, practices, and procedures that exclude them from the mainstream of society?
For us, for the most part, we're working at the level not of policy as much as the level of how it operationalizes on the street across our city. And the main way is that when people go to apply for jobs, they are discounted. They're not included in the pile of applicants because of their past. And the more recent it is, the harder it is. And so those initial opportunities when people really, really, really need to get to work, they are routinely just turned away at one employer after another. I would say on the housing front too, and this is something that we are addressing, it is very, very difficult to get on a lease if you have a conviction history. And it doesn't matter that you are in every other regard a stellar applicant for that lease in terms of your credit, in terms of your money, in terms of your earning, in terms of your job experience and your employment record. That one thing, that criminal conviction history, just takes you out of the pool, and that is a legal form of discrimination. There's nothing that really prevents a landlord from doing that, and so that is largely what we see. I think it's important also in the sort of the basic hierarchy of needs or whatever, we can tend to forget this, but I think the right to vote is huge. Again, something that most of us, it was just ingrained in us. This is a part of our civic life. This is a part of how I function in this community. What we have now is, for example, in Tennessee, more than 1 in 5 African Americans cannot vote. because of felony disenfranchisement. So that is effectively squelching a voice of an entire group of people.
Well, and the thing about that's so ironic and so frustrating is that if formerly incarcerated people are not allowed to vote, then they are not allowed to participate in the choosing of lawmakers who will pass laws that will affect them, that will affect all of us, that all of us are expected to follow, and not just laws, but will pass policies that will affect them directly. And so the problem then becomes, if you are doing everything that you all are doing as an organization to create opportunity, let's say, for people on the outside in the so-called free world once they have been released, if lawmakers are going behind those efforts and passing policies that limit job opportunity, passing policies that limit housing opportunity, passing policies that limit educational opportunity or make, higher education increasingly unaffordable, healthcare increasingly unaffordable, you could be doing everything right as an organization, but lawmakers could be, in effect, kicking the legs out from underneath your efforts on the back end to help people reintegrate. So in a sense, by not letting folks vote, they're not able to choose the people whose policies, whose actions could impact them quite negatively as they try and reintegrate into society. And that sort of brings to mind a little bit what's just happened in Florida. I'm sure the listeners know, that the last election, voters in Florida overwhelmingly, it had to be by like a 2-to-1 margin or something, and it was, or at least 60-40, right? That voters chose to restore voting rights to ex-offenders who had been disenfranchised permanently. And the voters, including obviously a lot of Republican voters, because they couldn't have gotten 60% plus with just Democrats, went and voted to change that law. And now you have the governor, Ron DeSantis, and other lawmakers in the state of Florida who are trying to restrict what the voters chose to do. The voters spoke with this very clear voice. And now you've got lawmakers who are trying to undo what the public has done. What is that about, in your estimation? Is that just politics? Are lawmakers just playing politics, thinking to themselves, oh, we don't want these people to vote because they're going to vote for the other party? Or is it rooted in some sort of existential fear that people have of ex-offenders that transcends party lines? What is this really all about?
Yeah, for us, we frankly don't really look at it through a political lens. We see our work as just about as transpartisan as it could be. We truly, truly believe and espouse the fact that it is in everyone's best interest if folks are able to restore their lives, get another chance after incarceration. So I think it is a deep-seated fear and contempt that for us as human beings, we are challenged to accept the other, challenged to overcome biases. For us, we just continue to kind of spread the word to everybody. We think that it has something in it for everyone.
So the thing that stands out to me when you mention the fear that people have and the insecurity that people have, whether it's employers, landlords, people in the community, neighbors, about formerly incarcerated people living and working amongst them, is, just this utter groundlessness of the stereotypes that we have about formerly incarcerated people or about people who have broken the law, quote unquote. Keeping in mind, the research says the vast majority of us, I think the number I saw once was like 90% of us have broken some law which could have, according to the letter of the law, and if we had been caught for doing it, landed us in jail and or prison for a period of time. So, we all sort of break laws, some of them quite minor, probably most of them quite minor, some of them maybe a bit more significant, but we have these groundless stereotypes about quote unquote ex-offenders, formerly incarcerated people. And when I came into your office today, it really, really struck me. I'd never been here before. It's the first time I've been in your office, and I had no idea the size and the scope of the operation. And when you come in, you're struck by the level of activity, the hustle and the bustle. You've got folks, going back and forth, trying to find out, okay, where's my job assignment? Looking for opportunity, excited to be here. All of that, right, wildly contradicts the assumptions that so many people have about the kind of folks that you work with. I mean, I'll be very honest with you. I don't work nearly as hard, and very few people I know who have college degrees, who have advanced degrees, work as hard as the folks who are coming in and out of this office. The pace, the level of activity is astounding. What does that say about the assumptions that people make regarding formerly incarcerated people, people who maybe at some point broke the law, found themselves in a bad situation. Now they're trying to turn it around. What does it say about those assumptions? And how does it not drive you absolutely insane to have to deal with that, to have to deal with the realization that on the one hand, there are people who have these horrible assumptions about the folks that you work with every day. And yet on the other hand, because you work with them every day, you know how false those assumptions are. Does that not just, it seems like it could be crazy making after a while to know the truth that you can see every day, but then have to deal with the lies that are out there in the larger society. And then I guess the related question is, how do we then push back on some of those assumptions and demonstrate conclusively to people the irrationality of their fears and their stereotypes?
We were founded by two Nashvillians, two visionaries 40 years ago, and in their latter years, as we spent a lot of time with them, and they were, I guess, spare with their use of words, they said it was about proximity, really just getting people connected and having people see what this is all about. But folks cross our threshold because they understand that this is a great way to get on their feet and really make it happen for themselves. And it's just that simple.
So when you work with employers, let's say, to help place some formerly incarcerated folks in their employment, what are some of the things that you have to work with them on? Because I'm going to assume that employers are going to have many of those same stereotypes that average everyday folks do. And if it's going to be a conducive environment for that formerly incarcerated person to not only get hired, but to really thrive on the job, that's going to be important to make sure the employer is creating as supportive an environment, not just welcoming that person on as an employee and hoping that it works out and giving them a paycheck for the work that they do at the end of the week, but really creating an environment that supports the transition of that person from incarcerated status into the so-called free world. What are some of the things you have to work with employers on to make sure that they understand about the folks who are going to be placed in their employment, to make sure that it really is a supportive environment?
Yeah, and speaking as an employer, I think that we are all challenged in being good employers and giving people the opportunity to be coached, to thrive, to evolve. I think that's a challenge for all of us as employers with all employees, and that really crosses the bounds. And so I think that we're not ever suggesting or asking any employer to do anything differently than what any of us employers are called to do every day with employees and staff. It's just kind of being aware that coaching is important, but we don't talk to employers who are now partnering with us or who one day will partner with us in any way really that sets our people apart, except for the fact that we can talk about how really motivated they are, how really as a group of people they have awesome statistics for success as employees. We're just saying, you guys need workers. We know people who want to work. We can do extra to make sure that really works well, but really tell us how we can be a part of your business in a way that's worthwhile for you and not setting our people as something different.
Well, talk a little bit about that. You mentioned the statistics regarding success, and although I don't think we ought to fetishize those because there are real humans behind numbers, and sometimes we get bogged down in the numbers and we forget the human beings behind them, but nonetheless, it is important, right, that these efforts of Project Return do have real success. Talk a little bit about the evidence of success that you all have had here in the Nashville area, because I think it's important for us to realize that these kinds of things, reintegrating formerly incarcerated people into the society, is not just a feel-good move. This isn't just to sort of warm, people's hearts and make us feel good about ourselves, though there's nothing wrong with that. It is also an effective way to produce real change in individuals' lives, but also real positive outcomes for the employers and the communities that are involved in the reintegration process. So talk a little bit about that.
The fact is, for example, our largest employment partner today at this period of time was a no 4 years ago. And by large, I mean we are a very significant part of their bottom line, their workforce, their success. And so the tangibleness is that as employers take on employees who come through our shop, they're one by one, I guess I would say sort of transformed by the experience, because you start from a place of bias, and then that proximity and that lived experience, that person is just a person, and it goes on from there. But more tangibly speaking, we, in 2018, I think we partnered with, I think it was 220 plus employers. We have partners who are on contract with us, and we staff their work sites, and then we have a lot of employers where we function sort of as an extension of their HR department, really. Whatever the company wants, we can do it that way. And at the end of the day, we're getting people employed by the hundreds each year. So we had an 81% job acquisition rate in 2018, and that was out of 556 people. So nearly 500 people, gained employment. That's a tangible difference for the economy of our city.
Well, and within the realm of criminal justice, my understanding, if I have the statistics correct and have looked at the research properly, it seems to suggest that your program is also measurably effective in reducing recidivism rates. And I don't want to place too much emphasis on that because obviously there are a lot of social factors that go into recidivism, and no one organization or one organization's efforts are going to be sufficient to really dramatically reduce recidivism rates overall over long periods of time. But that said, there does seem to be some evidence that the efforts of Project Return, at least insofar as it relates to those hundreds of people every year that you're getting placed, it really is reducing recidivism rates. So talk a little bit about that as well as a positive social benefit of the work that you do.
So our goal annually is to have less than 15% recidivism, which is remarkable. Like the rate nationally is going to be well beyond 50%. And so really we're very, very pleased with that. And we had an interesting thing in 2018. It was our largest year ever in terms of the volume. And so we really rose to the challenge, but came up short in our recidivism rate in 2018. We hit 18%. It was a high for us, and we were initially just very discouraged by that. But we drilled down into those numbers, and we realized, our two main programs are Pro-E, which is our transitional staffing program, and retention, which is this long walking alongside people as they navigate their first year of employment. We drilled down into our recidivism figure and saw that if they did one or other of those programs, the rate was 12.5%. So that was remarkable. Then we drilled down more and we saw that if they did both, if they did the transitional employment thing and then they segued into external employment and then did a year of retention, the recidivism rate was 6%. And it was this in-our-face sort of a affirmation of the quality and the extent of what we're providing and what tangible difference that makes not only for those individuals but also for this area, that we actually have really disrupted the recidivism rate at that level.
Well, I know that you all have also started recently a housing aspect to what Project Return does, opportunities for housing, or I think it's called the Pro-H program here at Project Return. Talk a little bit about that, because I know that one of the issues, in addition to finding steady employment that formerly incarcerated folks face, it is going to be, finding a place to live. There are landlords who are reluctant to have so-called ex-offenders, formerly incarcerated people on a lease. And even when communities have tried to do right by formerly incarcerated people, I get the feeling sometimes that the housing efforts, I don't know, there's something about them, right? So we tend to sort of default to this halfway house model, where you put a bunch of formerly incarcerated people in this transitional halfway house. And then, of course, communities get upset when the halfway house is down the street from where they live. And so then there's all kinds of tension there. Or you take, some communities have tried to place formerly incarcerated people all in like an enclave, almost like for lack of a better way to put it, almost like a colony, which is really, a horrible way to think of it, but it almost feels that way. Like, let's just collectivize all the formerly incarcerated people and keep them together. And maybe they think that's a positive model, but it seems to me that's just further isolating them in a large way. And I know that what you all are doing is different than that. So talk a little bit about, number one, why it's so important to make sure that formerly incarcerated people have access to housing, why it's so difficult currently for them to get housing, and what it is that you all are trying to do that's different than that halfway house and or sort of, putting all the ex-offenders in the same place kind of model.
So we really have been thinking about housing for a long time. We are decidedly not a transitional halfway house program. We partner with them, and that's a wonderful partnership, but that's not us. What we really came up against in a very sort of tragic and ineffective way was individuals who were doing everything right. They were getting their lives on track, and they were timing out of the halfway houses, timing out of their, uncle's home or their sofa or wherever they were able to stay, and they were earning money. They had a tracker. Everything was right. They were that stellar applicant, but they couldn't get in housing. And so we even took a little test case, and we deployed all of us for a week in December and just went really hard for one person. And we were driving up and down streets and really trying to find anything. And we ended up, I think we had to triple the down. It was an incredible amount of sweetening we had to do, including like taking the landlord out to lunch or something. Like we said, we've got to do something different. So we sat down with a friend who was also a consultant and a housing expert, and really started creating this model, which is it is intentionally scattered site. We did not want to create a colony or a compound or a place where a targeted population goes to live and is then targeted. It just is not. And we know as a society, we may not do it, but we do know that diversity is better, and that homogeneity is not the preferred thing. And we know there are people, they're just trying to live right. They're not trying to live in a compound. So we created this model where we purchase and rehab modest affordable housing, typically duplexes. We're now in basically 4 different regions of the city, and we rent those apartments only to people who've come through our program. So the relationship is there. They are expected to be a successful tenant. It's a below market rent. It's an aggressively below market rent, but it's a real lease. It's real rent, and it's otherwise real. We've been fortunate to be able to do some creative financing. We've gotten some grant money, and then we've leveraged that to get some really favorable loan terms from a couple of bank partners. And so we're doing well in terms of the acquisition and the sort of debt service. And then we have a pro forma that really, we just kind of keep our nose above the line in terms of staying in the black, but charging the lowest rents that we can. It's a tight little budget that we run this on. Parallel to that effort where we said, darn it, we'll buy our own houses and start doing that, we're also in the process of developing landlords similarly to how we've developed employers, where we've said, we get that you're at no, can we just talk to you a little bit? And so really trying to develop landlords who we can, because we can't house everyone, but we can bring more people across the city sort of on board with this.
So let's turn a little bit to the larger world of the politics of these kinds of issues. You mentioned when I walked in today that you are going to be going to the White House. Now, by the time that folks hear this episode, you will have long since done that. You were invited to go to the White House to commemorate the passage and the signing of the First Steps Act, which is the piece of criminal justice reform legislation that was passed and then signed by the president this year. And I want to talk a little bit about that legislation. Obviously, it is important to get any and all criminal justice reform legislation that we can as a country. I want to get your impressions on it, though, the good, the bad, maybe the inadequate, because my concern is that with this legislation or any other legislation, doesn't matter who the president is, doesn't matter who's running Congress, that we tend to oversell legislation a little bit in terms of thinking, okay, we passed this law or we passed that policy, that's going to solve the problem. I think the president is a good example of this. I mean, when he signed the First Steps Act into law, he announced, I fixed criminal justice. And he actually said, I think speaking directly to black folks, I fixed it for you, which is, offensive on multiple levels. I'm not asking you, obviously, as a director of a nonprofit that has to remain above partisan politics, to weigh in on the president and what the president said, but I do want you to sort of, if you're comfortable doing it, give us a sense of what you see in this legislation that is helpful, what you see in the legislation that might need some fine-tuning or some follow-up, because obviously it's not going to be the end-all, be-all fix.
For me, legislation around criminal justice is painfully incremental. And that's, I'm afraid it's my deficit that I have a hard time with that sort of incremental approach. My sort of endless respect goes out to anyone on any side of the aisle who is able to work that incrementalness in a way that is moving in the right direction. So I would prefer to be in this fight on the ground where we're working with individuals, but thank goodness that these incremental steps are happening. However they happen, it's the arc of justice and all that. So I think that the biggest thing about the First Step Act is it's purely a federal law, which affects a very, very actually small percentage of the people who are incarcerated in this country. And so in some ways it is symbolic. I've been impressed, though, with how much our country seems to feel as though we're all sort of moving in the direction of justice reform.
You make a really important point, I think, about incrementalism there that I struggle with, too, because I'm like you. I would rather not be involved in that very plodding, very slow step-by-step work. It's just not what I want to do, but I do have respect for those who have to go through that process because change doesn't happen overnight. We have a very deliberately slow-moving system in this country set up both at the federal level and the state level where it's really hard to push significant change through. Not impossible, but difficult. It was set up very much that way. It's very conservative in that regard, not ideologically, but just in terms of the speed and rapidity with which things get done. Given that that is true, given that incrementalism is and always has been sort of the name of the game when it comes to reforms of one type or another, how do you as an organization trying to do the work on the ground to bring as much change as possible, as quickly as possible, and really affect folks' lives, how do we make sure that that incrementalism serves as adrenaline rather than anesthesia? Because I do worry that sometimes, because of the incremental nature of change, when something gets done, people who maybe don't appreciate that there are 10 steps, who think, oh, well, the First Step Act or the whatever law it is, well, this has solved our problem for us, that then sort of throws a wet blanket on top of the efforts for change, rather than seeing, okay, First Steps Act is literally the first step. Now let's figure out what the second step and the third step is. So how do we make sure that the incremental advances are building on one another rather than coming across and being framed as the solution to the problem, which then ends up limiting the amount of change that we get? Does that make sense?
That is such a huge worry. I share that as well. I think that, for example, there are expungement laws. And so people not understanding the laws can think, well, everybody can just go get their record cleared. And it's so not true. But once people believe that, then it's actually a little bit more difficult than otherwise. And so it is a huge worry. It is a huge worry that we have thrown a bone, so to speak, and then the heat is off, and then I was in a conversation the other day with a group of people, and it was a very important and respected leader, actually, and we were talking about racial disparities in hiring, and he said, oh, that isn't happening now. That's in the past. And it was flooring. And so then, of course, I said, well, a white man with a felony record is more likely to get that job than his black counterpart with no record. And so it's that same thing where we feel like we have an illusion of evolution. So I don't know. I think that, doing this, getting the word out, really continuing to talk is got to be something.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things about the First Steps Act that concerns me, and it's not just this act, there's actually a lot of state level movements in this direction and various courts themselves that are playing around with the idea, and the First Steps Act sort of institutionalizes this in a way, playing around with the idea of these supposedly advanced risk assessment tools so as to determine whether someone is eligible for early release, because part of the law is about making more people eligible for early release. But in order to determine whether someone is eligible for early release, it seems as though they're going to be using these sort of algorithmic measures, right? Where you plug in all this data about the demographic characteristics of the offender, the neighborhood the offender's from, all these different things that could supposedly, ostensibly predict future offending. And then, the computer is going to spit out a risk assessment, and that's going to determine who's eligible for early release. And it concerns me, but I'd love to get your take on it, because it sort of operates on the basis of a myth, right? The idea that, computers aren't biased. They're just technology. Of course, they're programmed by human beings. And if the data that we feed them is problematic and biased in one way or another, then it's sort of, garbage in, garbage out, right? I'm worried about the use of these risk assessment tools because we know that they are based on existing social dynamics. So if you have low-income communities of color, marginalized urban spaces, which have higher rates of recidivism and criminal offending, not because the people are bad, but because the underlying social and economic dynamics do not always facilitate transition back into the so-called free world, then what you're doing is you're essentially holding the quote-unquote ex-offender responsible for the community they come from. You're sort of blaming them, and you're predicting out into the future something based on something in the past that may or may not be related to that person's experience, especially if they are fortunate enough to go through a program like yours, which has a much better outcome in terms of recidivism. So the first thing I'd love is sort of your take on these algorithmic measures and how they could be problematic. The second piece is, to what extent should we really be focused on the recidivism stuff at all? Because my concern with that is, from what I understand, it is incredibly easy to technically violate the conditions of probation or the conditions of parole. I mean, very simple things that for most people would not get us in trouble become, in a sense, almost like a status offense. It's an offense that wouldn't really be a problem if you were anybody but a quote unquote ex-offender or a formerly incarcerated person or a person on probation or a person on parole. And so if we're looking at these measures, which themselves are so easy to trigger and to trip, even if the person is living a really good life, doing everything they can to support their family, doing virtually everything right, but they happen to find themselves in the company or the presence of someone who has a record, and they're not supposed to hang out with that person, but they're back, maybe they go back to the neighborhood, maybe they're doing everything right, maybe they got a good job, but they technically violate these conditions. Now they're a quote unquote recidivist. To what extent should we even be looking at that as a primary determiner of the success or failure of so-called criminal justice reform? Because I worry that it just reduces real human beings with complex stories to these numbers on a plot chart or a graph.
I think that we at Project Return have created a little world where we don't have to focus on risk, but instead focus on opportunity. And I don't know how to bridge our world to the rest of the world. What we firmly believe here is people have needs, and that should not just be transformed into a label of high risk and then treated that way. Let's address the need. And then people have opportunities, except they don't. And so we need to create those opportunities like any of us needs. And so in this world of ours, that's, I think, part of the magic, that we're able to say, we're all risky at some level. Deprive me of every opportunity or every ability to care for my children or to have a roof over my head or to feed myself. I'm risky. And so we've created this world here where we can look at people as human beings and not have to rely on that metric and that label. I frankly don't know how a massive criminal justice system converts away from that risk to that human model, but I certainly think that's the key.
Well, but maybe in a sense you did make the connection there between what you all do in the larger system in a way. Back at the beginning, you mentioned that the vast majority of people who are currently incarcerated are getting out. And it seems to me that if we're going to be talking about something like risk assessment, that if you have people on one side who are saying, well, we need to assess risk before we do early release, well, why aren't we on the other side saying, hold on a minute, if you don't do early release, especially for the vast majority of non-violent type crimes, we're talking about average everyday folks who broke some laws, if you don't release those folks early, then they're going to go 5 more years or 10 more years or whatever it is with no job on a resume. They're going to go 5 more years or 10 more years with no income, 5 more years or 10 more years not being part of the larger community, not being part of their family unit. So in a way, the risk assessment argument is only looking at the one side of the equation, but it might actually be riskier to keep people in for longer, especially because since they are coming out at some point, the longer you keep them in, the less acclimated they will be to the outside world, the more institutionalized, I'm talking about now mentally and emotionally, they will be, and the harder it's going to be. It seems to me that the whole concept of risk assessment ought to lead us toward a bias in favor of early release rather than having to sort of wonder, gosh, should we do this? Should we not? It seems like the answer should be obviously yes.
But I think that also that gets to the punitiveness of our system. I mean, way back a billion years ago when I went to law school, we talked about the different frames for why we enforce criminal justice laws. And I think at one time in our country, I mean, we would talk about different purposes behind incarceration. And today, I think there are voices, there are important voices, and again, across the aisle, it's not a thing that way, but there are good voices about making good use, so-called, of prison time. But for the most part, it's punitive. And so there is real resistance to letting that dude out at 20 years because there's something in us that wants him to do that other 5. And it's not really taking into account that thing you're talking about, which is that, well, if we're really concerned about risk, then I think it might be better to go ahead and give him more of an opportunity to succeed when he gets out here.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up that point about the sort of the deliberate punitiveness of the system. And I honestly, I've joked about this before, but it's not funny. I think it is true, though. that some people are so addicted to the punitiveness and that model, and even really the sadism of punishment, having to teach somebody a lesson, that if I were able, let's just say hypothetically, to develop like this magical lollipop that I could give to everyone who's currently incarcerated, and I had proof, absolute scientific proof, that this lollipop had these magical properties that would 100% guarantee that that person would never offend again. They would never commit another criminal offense. And therefore, they ought to all be released. Like, this lollipop works. We're going to give them a lifetime supply of these lollipops. We're going to make sure they suck on these lollipops, and they're never going to commit a crime again. I really think that there would be millions of Americans who would say, you're just coddling these people. What are you talking about? Let him out, give him a lollipop. What kind of soft on crime thing is that? But here I've got proof that it'll work. They'll never commit another crime. And yet I think people would be outraged by the proposal because they would see it as not making these people suffer. What is it about us that wants people not just to be accountable for their actions, because I get that, but to actually suffer? And to not just suffer a little bit, but to suffer maximally, so much so that when we start talking about things like early release, and we start talking about things like decarceration, and we start talking about things like, alternative forms of punishment and restorative justice, people get, oh my God, what are you talking about? There's still that cadre of people who want folks to suffer. What is that about?
I think leadership is important. I think that you think about a small group of people, and there can be a voice that says, I know we're all angry right now. I know some of us got hurt right now, but let's pull together, stop, listen to one another, and see if there's a better way to move forward. I mean, that's how we can picture it in a small society or a small office of, 40 people or whatever. And so that sort of power, is, I think, important. And maybe we just need more of that. Part of what you were talking about too is, and it ties, and this is, maybe you can answer this, because I think this is one of the sort of ultimate curiosities in sort of, I think, your world of anti-racism, is that whole question of why people literally hurt themselves in order to hurt others. They vote against their own self-interest. They impoverish themselves in order to harm the other. And maybe this is related to that, because certainly it's not in our best interest as a society to ruin this individual.
I think to some extent it is as simple and also maybe as terrifying as this like psychological need that some folks have, I think, in this culture. Maybe it's true elsewhere, but it's certainly true here, to mark other people as bad, as deviant, as pathological, precisely so that they can feel good and normal and functional. It is almost as if I can't know that I'm good unless I know you're bad, right? Like, how will I know of my goodness unless I have marked someone else as the indicator of badness? It's like this psychological drive toward a culture of inequality, something that psychologist Michael Lewis wrote about in a book by that name many, many years ago, called The Culture of Inequality. This drive, and it explains why we don't ever solve the problem of crime or educational inequality or poverty and economic inequality. It's not that we're not smart enough. It's that at some level, inequality provides for the people who are on the top of the hierarchy, or even sort of in the middle, but at least above the midpoint. It provides us with others upon whom we can look down as a reminder of our own integrity, right? As a reminder of our own virtue. And it's a very hard psychological thing to move through. Having said that, though, I feel like some of the work that you all do could, in effect, if it can be scaled up and replicated around the country, could begin to chip away at that a little bit, because one of the things that you do, right, is you provide an opportunity for employers, for landlords, for all kinds of different stakeholders in the community to get to actually know on a personal and human level ex-offenders, which, once I get to know people, my need to stigmatize them should by necessity go down. And so it seems to me like, in a way, the work, the real human connection work that you're doing is one way in which we might be able to get at that psychological tendency that I'm identifying and that Michael Lewis talked about in his book. Have you all done any, because I think this would be helpful in pushing that along, have you all done any sort of narrative project where you, not just the people who you've helped to get jobs and to reintegrate into the community, because I know you've done some narratives with those folks, but have you gotten some narrative, some input from employers, from landlords, talking about the way that this has transformed them, not just the fact that they got a good employee or they got a great tenant and, oh, it's wonderful, but how it's really changed and shaped the way that they think about formerly incarcerated people, how it's maybe challenged some of their stereotypes, because I feel like those narratives would be incredibly powerful. We know people do not usually change their views on things because of data and statistics and scholarly analysis. They change because of stories. And it seems to me like you are creating the opportunities for some really powerful stories. So have you done any of that, or do you have plans to do any of that in the coming years? Not enough.
We sort of always end up choosing our time for the work rather than the narrative collection. But employers are really, they're an amazing reserve of sort of untapped, firsthand experience, really sort of unfiltered. They're not gonna say it was good if it wasn't. And we get that from time to time, just organically. Sometimes it's around tragedy. We heard, and this is someone who came through a couple of years ago. She basically had a blood clot and died, and so her employer was just, extolling, said, if only my whole workforce were like her. So these are individual employers out there, and I think part of it is we really do need to go after that narrative more, because that is what can be, I can only be shrill for so long, but this, regular person out here who's running a factory in town that's, that they can just talk about like what they've seen. I think that's really important. Now we do sometimes think of our individuals who are workers as sort of like just walking ambassadors, just by their very being. By their very being, they are carrying a message that's more loud than mine or yours. Day after day, what they're doing, and when they send in a rent check, like that is a statement, unlike anything I could say. And so the critical mass, I suppose, changes things over time. There's a few employers around the country who have been smart about this for many years at a high volume, and as they have longitudinal data that says these employees are through the roof good. And so really just getting that out there more is really what we need to do.
It seems to me that the heart of what you all are doing is really about restoration, restorative justice, and, maybe this word redemption. Here we are in the buckle of the Bible Belt, and I know that the term redemption has very spiritual overtones for some, but even for people who aren't spiritual or religious and don't look at it that way, it has philosophical overtones. What about this work on a personal level for you is redemptive? Obviously, it is redemptive for the people with whom you work, formerly incarcerated folks who come through here and get placed in jobs and housing because of your efforts and their own commitment and their own efforts. But what about it is redemptive, not only for them, but for you personally when you turn off the lights and walk out the door every day? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think redemption is, I said something archetypal earlier. If anything is archetypal for us as human beings, I think it is the idea of coming back for another chance, of having another try at something, at being a better person. I tell myself that part of what I'm doing every day is trying to find that best self inside me and bring it forward and put it to work. And so that's just the same as what the people who are coming through here are trying to do. So tapping into that sense of redemption, I think that there's many folks who find a way to volunteer inside prisons. And there's something that we feel when we go inside prisons. It's an intense feeling as though we're like really touching another person. This thing, when they get out here, this is when redemption, rubber really hits the road, and redemption really happens through our daily lives, through our footfall, through our choices. And so operationalizing our sort of romanticism of what redemption can be, I think is really important about this work. Everybody's saying that the people coming to get our help are getting a second chance. Well, if we're people who had all that we had, and have made mistakes, I mean, it's a deep thing to be able to have a positive impact in another person's life in some kind of way. And I think that's why volunteers come to us. I think that's why donors come to us. It's a way to really, giving back is not, that phrase does not do justice to what this is about.
For those who are interested in contacting Project Return to find out more about their work, to make a contribution, or to possibly figure out ways that you and your community could replicate some of the fantastic work that they're doing here in Nashville, Tennessee, you can find out more about them at their website, which is projectreturninc.org. That's projectreturninc.org. You can also find out more about them on Twitter. Their Twitter handle is at Project Return TN, as in Tennessee, at Project Return TN. And also on Facebook, you can find out more about their efforts. If you want to find out more on Facebook, you can do that at their organizational Facebook page, the address for which is also going to be under Project Return TN, at Project Return TN, as in Tennessee. And that'll do it for another episode of Speak Out with Tim Wise. Please join me again in 2 weeks for the next episode of the show. And in the meantime, you can check out my articles at medium.com, as well as my website, www.timwise.org. And follow the show on Facebook at Speak Out with Tim Wise, on Twitter at Speak Out Tim Wise, as well as on Instagram. Take care and join us again in 2 weeks.
Who's rich?